I'm Jason Pack.
And I'm Jane Kinnenmont, and this is Disorder.
It's the show where when you think the world is so mad it can't get any madder, we actually find ourselves at a new level and we're just searching and seeking for any semblance of order or an analysis of how did we get to this place, Jane. And I think you hit the nail on the head. Trump, he was just so bored of peace. It's like too boring. Hello. Peace is like so 2021.
That's right. Well, it's certainly taken many by surprise that the president who ran partly on his opposition to the Iraq war has proven to be quite into military intervention, but with the view that a lot can be done from the air without putting American boots on the ground. Of course, you and I will remember when Iraq started, there were also a lot of theories that such a war could be done very quickly with minimal boots on the ground, but it's a lot easier, as we know, to make those predictions at the start of wars than it is to get out of them. So we're going to talk more about why this has happened now, how it interacts with domestic political calculations, and although things are shifting very rapidly, we will try to talk through what could be some of the better or the least worst scenarios for what is going to happen to Iran and its Gulf neighbours, who are also facing disruption and disorder that they had never sought.
Well, I think that we also need to call a spade, and I, for one, am amazed that Trump was able to, working with Israeli intelligence, get and kill the Supreme Leader. Like, from a technical perspective, like with the illegal kidnapping of Maduro, I'm amazed that they pulled it off. And, you know, we want to call balls and strikes in this program. The interplay of the American intelligence apparatus and the military and targeteering and Air Force and anti-aircraft and all of our allies in the Gulf and Israel, their ability to achieve certain things beyond what we thought were possible is amazing. Why on earth the Ayatollah was not 10,000 feet below ground? It has just emerged that on Saturday morning local time in Iran, American and Israeli intelligence spotted that the entire Iranian leadership, including Ali Khamenei and his son Mojtaba and IRGC commanders, were going to meet in central Tehran to discuss the negotiation strategy. And it's like, McFly, hello? Is that not amazing, Jane?
Well, there's two views on this. One is that they had a kind of once-in-a-lifetime opportunity and took it. The other is that they've had those opportunities before but politically didn't want to do it. Clearly, there has been weeks of build-up to this war because we've seen a huge amount of American military hardware being deployed to the region for quite a long time. So it doesn't seem like the whole thing has been built around a sudden opportunity prompted by carelessness. You know, we saw a similar scenario also with Hezbollah leaders getting together just before they were all attacked. You know, we saw Hamas negotiators, they largely escaped, but they were attacked in Doha when they were meeting to discuss a proposal. So, you know, the third time should have been foreseen. And yeah, one wonders what levels of recrimination are going on inside the Iranian system, because this whole system has been built around deterring and evading the US and Israel, and it has signally failed, with this being just the latest piece of it.
There's an aspect of the Darwin Awards here. And of course, I don't support the attack. I think it's illegal from an American congressional perspective. But that's separate from what I'm talking about here. When they were caught off guard during the 12-day war because they're like, oh, but there's going to be another round of negotiations. Witkoff said, I'll see you next week. So we just thought, okay, we'll meet and whatever. It's like, oh my God, because this has already happened before. There's like, oh, Rubio is flying to Tel Aviv on Monday, and Witkoff said in Geneva, we're going to meet in Oman again next week. So everything is fine. I cannot believe that they fell for this again. It's really remarkable, Jane.
I mean, on Friday, there was already so much speculation that something was coming because you saw all these travel advisories, evacuations of people in the region. And I didn't speak to anyone in Iran on that day, but I was in touch with one friend who works on dialogue and peace work who'd been in touch with a senior Iranian and said they think that the Americans are about to strike because they think that the positions are too far apart. So clearly it wasn't a total surprise. But it is interesting that Khamenei himself wasn't better protected. You know, after the 12-day war last year, there were reports coming out of Iran that he had to remove himself somewhat from some of the decision-making because he was in hiding, didn't have phone communications, etc. So, I don't know. I think there's probably a lot more still left to come out, including the possible intelligence penetration of his own advisors and people close to him. I mean, there may
100%.
be people in the system who felt that it was his time.
Yes.
And of course, he was 86, you know, so there has been for a long time within Iran this pent up succession planning struggle and sense of, you know, what's going to come next. And it seems like after the 12-day war, there has been some planning put in place because they knew that, you know, he wasn't going to be around forever.
In terms of that, it was definitely coming. I mean, British travel advice on Thursday, Friday was, we're going to evacuate the embassy in Tel Aviv. And that was on Thursday and Friday. And the businesses that I work with who are Libya focused were already telling their Dubai employees to go back to Libya, right? That was happening on Thursday and Friday. And
Right.
I was having to advise friends, you know, I don't think you should be transiting through Doha to go to Central Asia. You can fly through Istanbul. So this was literally the most obvious thing on the planet, which leads to the interesting bit that you said. And I just want to draw out the wisdom there for the mega orderers, Jane. It's that the system may have been penetrated. Delcy Rodriguez was working to some extent for the Americans, and people around her tipped off the Trump regime so that they could get Maduro. So there's going to be more that's going to come out, and this is going to be in secret documents that will come out in 50 to 75 years when they're declassified. And I wanted to lead by saying I am very impressed. That doesn't make any of this legal or rational, but I didn't think that they would be able to be so caught off guard. Like, I'm also a little surprised that they don't rate their ability to hit Israeli or American targets enough, that they're having to just randomly attack, you know, hotels
Yeah.
in the Gulf where you're probably killing a majority of Muslim clientele and just random tourists and stuff. So I never thought very highly of the capabilities of the Iranian regime, but I had a degree of fear in terms of like, well, these guys are going to have, you know, put mines in the Strait of Hormuz. And if anything gets to this existential level, you know, Brent crude is going to be up at 130 a barrel because they have, you know, attacked Abu Qaik again and mined the Strait of Hormuz. And it's not that that can't happen now, but I was still afraid that one of the reasons why this was bad, in addition to the lack of an end game, its illegality, and the number of civilians and innocents who will get killed, was that, oh my God, they're going to blow up a cake, mine the Straits of Hormuz, and hit a range of American and Israeli military targets from the get-go because it's existential.
Yeah.
And are you on my side here, Jane, that you're kind of surprised? Like, wait a second. They attacked the Palm Jumeirah and they didn't, like, accomplish some of these military objectives?
Yes and no. And I mean, I think the Strait of Hormuz is very disrupted, but a lot of it is also ships not going through because they've got problems with actually being insured.
But it's not like mines have blown up. I mean, I want to be clear. As we're speaking on Sunday, it may happen by Monday. But if you had mined it, that could have all just blown up already.
Yeah. So to go like back a step, I guess we have both been looking at this region for just over 20 years, right? And throughout that period, there has been so much strategic discussion and wargaming around will there be a war between the US and Israel and Iran, and what would that look like? And there's a whole bunch of times in different jobs that I've either written or like co-drafted scenarios for how a war would play out, and those scenarios for so long looked so bad that they did deter war, and they helped to shape the incentives for the Iran nuclear deal, because the US felt that war would be costly and diplomacy would work. But of course, when we look back, we saw people imagining scenarios where Iran would activate its network of allied non-state actors around the region, obviously Hezbollah, Hamas, the Houthis, it could close the Strait of Hormuz, etc. Over time, most of those capabilities have been degraded until Iran's deterrence has basically collapsed. And the Strait of Hormuz, there still remains a lot of damage they could do there. One interesting report I saw this morning was Iran warning American ships not to go through it. That says to me they're still worried about China turning on them if they absolutely go all out and block the straits. They've obviously lost a lot of their options in terms of being able to activate the regional armed groups. And so with the Gulf, there is a strategy there. It's just not a good one. They are basically betting that if they can spread the pain of the war, it will help them. And they hope, I think, that Gulf countries will be forced to try to mediate and calm things down, because they won't be able to.
I see it differently than that,
But
Jane.
I think that's what Iran is calculating. I think it may well be a terrible miscalculation.
I think that's a
There is
horrible
real risk.
miscalculation.
The Gulf countries, who have actually been their only friends recently, they are never going to forgive this. Even Oman has been attacked, as of reports this morning. Missiles sent towards its Duqm port, which is a really vital part of its economic diversification. And Oman has put its neck on the line, going to Washington, trying to do the mediation, unless the Iranians think that that's all been a facade. But I don't think they do. I think they know the Omanis and they do trust them, and they just don't care.
Lots of very interesting points there. I agree with two critical pieces of analysis. You and I have wargamed this war, as you said, for the 25 years that we've been in this field. And the difference is the extent to which the post-October 7th wars degraded Hamas, Hezbollah, and the Houthis to be used as proxies to retaliate. That was always going to be the primary deterrence. And then the 12-day war has degraded the ballistic missile capability, which is the secondary deterrence. I would have thought they had tricks up their sleeves when it comes to Hormuz. But then the miscalculation that you point out, that the only ones who would want to bring the war to a conclusion while the region could be salvaged in a way that the Iranians are still having their regime in power would be some of their allies in the Gulf, particularly the Omanis, but also the Emiratis and Qataris. I really believe that this is the war of Epstein distraction. In 1701, the Bourbon monarch in Spain died without an heir, and the French were going to insert their Bourbon successor, and the Prussians, Habsburgs, and Brits said no, and we had the War of Spanish Succession. And it lasted from 1701 to 1714. Trump is obviously in these Epstein files. The Epstein thing gets worse and worse and worse and worse. And Lutnick and all these Republicans are in it. And Bondi is now under tremendous pressure from Republicans, not just Massey, but every kind of Republican, to release the real stuff that's being covered up in the files. And this is all coming to a head. I see the Venezuela raid and this both being regime decapitation operations as, the wars of epic Epstein distraction. So we have Spanish succession and Epstein distraction. I hope that it doesn't last for 13 years, but is easily going to last till the midterms. He will do anything to wag the dog and distract and try to get his poll numbers up because they're in the toilet. And that, to me, is why there's so little sense of what comes next and strategy. Like, oh, the Iranian people are free now. I just leave them to be free. And
So you're telling us, Jason, it's not Operation Epic Fury, it's Operation Epstein Fury, right?
100%, 100%. I just like to call it the wars of epic, endless Epstein distraction.
Yeah, I think this is really fascinating because I think as of a few months ago, Trump could have gone in a whole bunch of different directions on Iran. He'd been doing diplomacy, he did last year's war. Of course, as we've discussed, he said after the attacks last year that Iran's nuclear program was completely obliterated and wasn't a problem anymore. And there was a while where if you talked to Iran hawks from Washington, they were hopping mad because the president didn't want to know anything that might involve going back into Iran. Now, that said, I think that for several months there have been predictions that something would happen, but that maybe that would be another round of fighting between Israel and Iran. I heard, again, a hawkish perspective in November from an American who argued Israel is going to go back in and destroy Iran's missile facilities, and the best scenario is if everyone basically pretends that it didn't happen and keep it as quiet as possible. Obviously, that's not where we now are. I heard Russian analysts who had visited Tehran back in late November saying that diplomats in Tehran were all expecting another round of war, at least involving Israel and Iran. But no, everyone felt essentially powerless to stop it. But this is something different. This is a full-on American-led talking about regime change war. And yet it's talking about regime change. And then, one of Trump's most recent posts is saying, well, hopefully now the IRGC, the Iranian Revolutionary Guard Corps, will just merge with the patriotic people of Iran and everyone will be free.
That's so likely, Jane. Everything that I have studied leads me to believe that that is very likely.
They're just chill guys, right? I mean, once they get into the streets, they'll probably have a beer and everyone will dance, I mean, it's bizarre. But I do think that it is, again, a complete contrast to Iraq. With Iraq, you had a lot of planning, but the plans were totally wrong and based on false assumptions. And here it seems to be deliberately
a lot of the plans were not
opposite.
used. A lot of the plans were State Department plans. And if we go back, one of the things that the neocons, particularly Wolfowitz and Feith, but also the archcons, Cheney, is that they wanted Pentagon to be running the show. And in a classically imperial fashion, they cared more about the intra-imperial dimension, i.e. the struggle against institutional adversaries.
Yes.
And why is that classically imperial? Because when it came to the British role in the Hejaz or in the Najd, it was the struggle between the India office and the Cairo office. It wasn't the struggle between different local factions that mattered. It was the Hejaz was going to be the area where the Cairo office wanted to do certain things, but the India office people were very happy to back Ibn Saud to attack other British-backed proxies, right? So it wasn't that the plans really were put into place in Iraq. I would say that we had a classically imperial tug of war of internal bureaucratic forces, and that's not possible in a Trump administration because institutions have no power. It's not like Hegseth has a team of all the best planners, consulting scholars, and then the National Security Council has one and Rubio has one. No, there's no plan at all. There's been no gaming exercises. There's no institutional power bases in Trump land because it's like a ideological, personalized dictatorship where only what the Supreme Leader says matters, and there are no institutional factions. Susie Wiles could be saying, hey, I think it would be wise if we try to bring this to an end because the media numbers will be good now, but if we wait 2 or 3 more weeks when there's looting in the streets and it's a bit of a mess, that won't be as good for your midterm election.
Absolutely.
But she's not an institution, right? the lack of institutional checks and balances could lead to a very bold decision on behalf of Trump and his team, which could curtail the war. So that this, lack of imperial institutional internal rivalries between state and Pentagon, or between the NSC and the Pentagon, could be advantageous. I wonder if he simply lacks the political nous to take the victory lap in a way that might work. And to use this note, I want to zoom out again, because again, I think that our role is to call a spade a spade. I'm no fan of Trump. I'm not a super fan of this operation. But I've spoken to my Persian friends in Sweden. I've spoken to some Iranians here in the UK, many of whom, not all, many of whom are supportive of what has happened, and people are optimistic. I mean, the classic idea about the LA Persians all celebrating is not completely wrong, right? So there are many Iranians and Iranian diaspora in specific who are quite optimistic. And there is a possibility for a leader who is still just trying to distract from Epstein and has absolutely no plan and isn't even being led by Netanyahu. I think that he is just doing this himself. Netanyahu doesn't really care about what Trump's endgame is. Netanyahu has his own endgame.
Yes.
There still is a possibility for something reasonable to come out of this. But the problem is you would have had to have learned the lessons of, I think, Libya even more than Iraq, because Libya was a place where there was a popular uprising as part of the 2011 Arab uprisings, whereby the locals were calling for a NATO no-fly zone. And the Arab League on March 12th, 2011, passed the resolution asking for this no-fly zone. But unfortunately, the plot was lost in terms of how to interact with them and the reconstruction phase and a million things that then went wrong, which I talk about in actually both of my books. So there are some real serious things that could go right and 90,000 things that could go wrong. I think they're unlikely to just randomly go right if the reason you've been doing the whole thing is the war of epic Epstein distraction and not an attempt to punish the Iranian regime for all of its terrorism and killing its own people.
Right. Well, let's talk about some of those lessons and perhaps about what could go right, because, I'm also very worried and against this attack. I think it's very problematic that the US is more than ever completely unconcerned about breaching international law, norms, taboos.
That's only the least of it, Jane.
But this is what you've made your points also about the domestic illegality. From my point of view, as someone that is quite focused on international law and having a functioning multilateral system, I'm worried about this part of it. I think it's part of
Would you be worried if there was a congressional vote, though?
Yes, I would still be worried about it, because I do think that the fact that the Iranian system is very repressive doesn't make external violent regime change a better thing. I think that we have been here before, and I think that we do have a problem in the international system that we have quite good legal restraints on starting wars and how those wars are promulgated, although now those are being broken again and again. We do not have a good...
Here.
Please let me just say my point and then let me hear from you. We do have a issue that we don't have a good way to deal with autocracies repressing their own people. And as you know, there has been a lot of discussion around the right to protect and the concept of humanitarian intervention, and it has never become something that works systematically, because it always does seem to be co-opted by great power interests. So we do have a problem that I think that the war is wrong, but I do also think that the repression and the massacres of Iranian protesters are wrong, and we don't have good tools from the rest of the world to solve those problems, and that leaves people stuck between, I think, two evils and trying to work out what the lesser of them is. Please, I have made my point, and I'd like to hear your point.
Of course, R2P operations have not been immensely successful. I don't think that the problem is the international law aspect, because from what little I understand about international law, you could make a case that this is in fitting with it. If the Trump regime had wanted to do that and had gotten congressional approval. Because what do you know? They had massacred 30,000 of their own people, of which a local body such as the Iranian Transitional Council could have said, we are the sovereign in becoming, and we ask for the U.S. to launch decapitation strikes against a regime, and we assert that we have true sovereignty. And I think Reza Pahlavi, sitting in L.A., would say, I'm actually the one who's the sovereign in becoming, and I've asked for this. So it's much more complicated, and that's why it's the congressional level which is the problem to me, because you easily could have an international legal justification. I would argue that this is still part of the October 7th wars. The Iranians either directly aided Hamas or indirectly, and this is the back end of that war, for which, from an Israeli perspective, I think that they definitely have international law on their side. They just don't give a shit enough to make that case. But as I understand it, the international law stuff can be legitimate. The problem is that we didn't have a congressional vote. And by not having a congressional vote, American power is not used with the checks and balances of the American system. The American system requires a role for Congress in the declaration of war, that's a check and balance. Just like Trump can't just do tariffs because Congress has to approve taxation. You can't say, oh, it's not taxation, I have the emergency, whatever. And it's like, no, because this is actually a tax. This is a war, Jane, and the issue is the congressional aspect. I think that international law is not a strong enough mechanism, and I'm willing to defend to hell or high leather that from an international legal perspective, it's legal. They haven't made the case well enough, but if they wanted to, certainly the Israelis have everything on their side that this is a legal war. The thing that's necessary is in the Israeli and American systems to do the things within the government that makes that happen, and that's what was not done. The problem is that he actively doesn't believe in democratic governance.
Right. He doesn't believe in democratic governance or international law, and I think we're going to disagree about.
Yeah, but the international law stuff could easily be done. There's a huge R2P aspect, and then from the Israeli perspective, any strike that they do on Hezbollah or the Houthis is defensive. So they're within.
From their perspective, I mean, I think the international legal case for that is highly questionable. What we can agree on is that Trump is not interested and has basically said he doesn't need to think about international law because he has his own conscience to think about. So the case is not being made, and as you say, the case is not being made domestically. What do you think happens next? How is Congress going to respond? And explain to the non-American here, could that be something that is also taken up by the Supreme Court? The extent of the president's war powers? No. So it's down to Congress to react.
And keep in mind that Vietnam and parts of the Iraq and certainly this recent Venezuela thing are all done without congressional approval. And the difference might be that we have had senators and Congress people saying this is a thing which requires the War Powers Act. And Trump hoisted himself on his own petards by using the word war rather than special military operation. I was hoping he was going to say we have a very special military operation.
It's the most special one.
By the way, it's the most special one ever. It's the biggest, the best, the specialist. I think that there is a strong case, Jane, that if there was an absolute landslide to 67 senators for the Dems in the Senate and a majority in the House, you could impeach him on this. It's an impeachable offense. It's a congressional thing because it violates the articles of the Constitution. And it's one of the things like he could easily be impeached for taking the Qatari plane. It violates the emolument clause. But it's not a Supreme Court thing. The way our system works is the Congress has the task of holding the president to account. And it has certain congressional responsibilities. For example, making taxes by having bills that start in the House, or voting for war powers when there's a war. The Supreme Court can't do anything until the Congress makes that case.
Right.
So, again, that's the way the system works. I do want to just belabor this international war point for 2 more minutes because I think it's really important. Let's say everyone is acting under supposedly international law. I just don't think that there is a body right now which can adjudicate between some brilliant American lawyers or Israeli lawyers who could be put forth, and then some Iranian lawyers who could be put forth, or European ones, or Hague ones, saying that it's not R2P. In other words, not only would that drag on indefinitely, we don't have a definitive mechanism for in which that international legal case could be adjudicated. We do have a thing called...
It should be the UN.
Yeah, but it's not able to adjudicate that in real time. We do have a thing called Congress, and Congress really can function. It's choosing to not do so, and that's why I think that the congressional aspect is so much more important. No one is saying that Congress doesn't work or Congress doesn't have authority, like the way that the UN can just be vetoed by Russia, or the ICC is going to have whatever problems it has. Congress can do its job, and I think that that's a very different situation.
But if Congress supports wars of aggression in hypothetical future situations, that doesn't make them legal in any international sense. And what it would leave the rest of the world with is an unpredictable.
But can you think of an example where an American war has had a congressional approval but has been illegal under international law? From 1776 to now, I cannot think of one, Jane.
What was Congress's position on the invasion of Iraq?
I think it's complicated enough as to, muddy the waters.
But do you think the invasion of Iraq was an illegal war? Or you think that was also legal?
Let's pause here for a second and say, I don't really understand enough, but the congressional case was based on the idea of the uranium and the dodgy dossier and all of that. So that may be an exception, that we can think of one example in 250 years based on lying intelligence. But for the most part, the congressional system is what prevents us from getting into Vietnams and Iraqs and Irans. And that's a system that we largely have to have faith in. And I'm not exactly sure why even the Republicans who oppose Trump's unfettered powers, and MAGA, who are anti-war, the strong anti-war part of MAGA, have not been able to push more.
So how is this going to play out domestically? And do you think that the domestic politics are going to encourage Trump to want a quick exit and a declaration of success, or a continuing involvement if indeed it is about distraction? Like, which way do you see the domestic politics influencing what the US does next on Iran?
It can pull both ways. I'm sure that he's going to want it to continue from the cover-up perspective of Epstein and going into the midterms to just have a war. Wartime presidents tend to do better at re-election, blah, blah, blah. But the domestic angle is that if he can bring it to a halt quickly, those issues of not having congressional approval and those issues of the MAGA people who say, hey, but we voted for you to end the forever wars, they'll want it to be brought to an end quicker. So those two things are going to pull in opposite directions. On the question of speed, I think that we can talk about this more in the Ordering the Disorder, but we have to talk about the lack of depth that the Pentagon has pointed out. There is an interesting Wall Street Journal article that I will share some pictures in the Substack because the Wall Street Journal is pay for. It's not worth having a link to it in the show notes. America and Israel and our Gulfi allies only have a certain number of missile interceptors, many of which were used in the 12-day war. And, they have a week or 10 days worth of cover. And at that point, any Iranian missile will be able to get through beyond that point because they're just out of missile defense, right? And I'm not sure you can continue to prosecute this war if you don't have, enough things to keep Iron Dome and whatever in stock. Right. So again, I'm not a technical expert, but in terms of the length of the war, as much as the international legal things might seem to be important, that to me seems that's going to be a determinant factor.
So do you think that bodes well for efforts to calm down the immediate fighting? And then what does that mean? Because I think we're probably not going to see a quick regime collapse or a quick regime change in a matter of days. Things are really unpredictable, but I think things are being set in motion that are very, very deep and very disruptive for the future of the Iranian system. But I think it's unlikely that it would quickly collapse. I can't see the mechanism through which it would quickly collapse, and I can't see how even a massive popular uprising will get that Iranian system to break.
I'll see that one differently then, just for the sake of debate.
Sure.
I think we simply don't know, Jane. So we know that we have an interim supreme leader who is named Arafi, and we know that Larijani is going to be a top player in diplomatic interactions with Europe and the West. But they could wait a few more days, soften up the regime in its command and control, and then the Americans, Israelis, and Iranian diaspora could say now is the time to take to the streets, and the regime could be toppled in a matter of hours. So again, I don't know if that will happen. It might not, but we simply cannot say, right?
How would they topple them? Do you see like a mass civilian uprising, or do you think there are people with hidden arms? Like, how would that call for the uprising, which I think is already happening? How would it translate into an actual overthrow?
Well, there's a Libyan-style case, and then there are Egyptian and Tunis-style cases. The Egyptian or Tunis cases are enough people take to the streets, a lot of not only IRGC, but Basijis and others say, the goose is cooked. The goose is cooked. We actually would rather that our daughters not get, raped and killed for not wearing their hijabs. We're switching sides. So I think that is less likely than in a place like Egypt or Tunisia, but it's not impossible. But then the Libyan case is just that we have a civil war, right? And that particularly in the non-Persian parts of the country, and you have to keep in mind that there are 20 plus million Turkic speakers, and those are Azeris, and then you have millions and millions of Kurds. They begin to have militias, a Libyan-style regional militias, and there is a civil war, right? I think that that's a very likely outcome. Who can say what will happen at that point? I can't. It wouldn't happen immediately in that scenario, but far be it from me to say, A, whether this was legal under international law. I think that there are many cases that it would be, from what I've studied, and far be it from me to say who will win a civil war or an uprising when it comes out. We have no idea. There's no way, no one, not even the participants can anticipate that, Jane.
I agree that it's highly, highly unpredictable, but I think that the I think it actually may be less likely that you'll see those kinds of changes in the very immediate term. I
No, but
think,
the Libyan case took between February 17 and the fall of Tripoli on August 20 and the death of Gaddafi on October 20. And Liberation Day was October 23rd. So that seems like a reasonably timeline if the Americans and Israelis want to play
yeah,
the Air Force of the uprising, right? Because it worked in Libya only because the uprising had an Air Force. So I don't think that Trump wants that, but he may be forced into it because he has no strategy. And then he finds that he can't withdraw because what are they going to do? Allow the onfall to happen again? Keep in mind, in 1991, when
yes,
Herbert Walker Bush, and I think that this is actually a better analogy than Iraq or Libya, is that they liberated Kuwait, and that was good, and it had international law, and it had a huge coalition. And then they made a mistake, which was obviously unbelievably tragic. They said to Shia and Kurdish supporters of the American operation, you may now liberate yourself. You're now free to overthrow Saddam. But they didn't do much to support them. They
right.
didn't even really do much of a no-fly zone over Kurdistan. And the Anfal campaign happened, and people were gassed, and tens of thousands of people were killed, you know. So I, of course, can imagine Trump being an evil and cynical bastard. He might call for such an uprising and then
Yeah.
not protect the people who do it. But
I mean, that's
he may,
happened. That's already
he may
happened.
also see that he has to protect those people and play the role. I do think no matter what, the Israelis would be the Air Force of that because their interests diverge at that point, right? And that's why I don't think that Trump is just acting on Netanyahu's say-so. Netanyahu has wanted this regime change his entire political career, right? So he's not going to all of a sudden abandon the
No.
anti-Ayatollah, in a way, pro-Israeli uprising, whereas Trump may do so.
Yeah, I mean, I would be interested if we saw also a scenario that like has been seen in previous transitions from authoritarian rule in some countries, which is to get some kind of agreement between people within the regime that realise things have to change and people within the opposition that would be up for a negotiated transition. I also think there's no obvious signs of this happening, and I'm not sure that the Iranian system has that level of adaptability or willingness to compromise with its own people. And I think where it's been looking at compromises, ironically, it's been looking at compromises with the US, but over very limited areas. You know, how can we compromise over the nuclear issue and get pressure taken off us that way? And there have been some voices within Iran, including former President Rouhani, saying actually security is in the social contract at home. So to me, to order the disorder, a good outcome could possibly come through that kind of pathway, that you would have people within the system realizing the only way to be secure is actually to rebuild that social contract with our own people and listen to opponents who are, or people at home who want change and want reform, but aren't calling for external intervention. But I really don't see signs that such a way out is likely. It would be interesting to see if it was possible to consider anything like that, but it may only be wishful thinking at this point. It would be a more peaceful.
That's not what I want. I think that you and I are probably going to differ in what we see as ideal from this perspective. I think an accommodation with the regime is something that Trump would want. If he could deal with Arafi or Larijani and say,
yes,
sign this thing that shows that you're not going to do the nuclears
I agree
and
with
that
you.
you're not going to buy ballistic from Russia. He'll say this is the greatest victory ever, and he won't care that there hasn't been a regime change, and he'll abandon the people. That's not good from my perspective. I wouldn't have launched this thing, but now that you've done it, you've got to do it. So
I think I'm talking about something different though, which is if the system was less focused on making an agreement with the US, which has preoccupied its diplomacy for quite a long time now and more focused on making an agreement with its own people instead of shooting the people who want change, I think that would be the best way to order the disorder. If the regime basically saw its way of saving itself as being agreeing on a political compromise and on opening up, on resetting the social contract, on giving more say to the people, on allowing more social freedoms. We saw after Saddam's invasion of Kuwait, which you mentioned, Kuwait's parliament had been suspended for years. And after the liberation of Kuwait, the Kuwaiti ruling family reset its relations with the parliament. It reset its relations also with Kuwait's Shia minority, because they saw that, in fact, Kuwaiti Arab Shia had been nationalists. They'd been loyal to Kuwait. They hadn't, for the most part, gone to fight for Iraq. And they could see that society had stood firm, at least this is how Kuwaitis tell it, and that society should be able to take part in parliament, that their own people were actually not the enemy and the enemy was somewhere else. And I think this is a big part of the problem with this system in Iran, is that it seems to have defined young people seeking political change as the enemy within, as though these are all agents of destruction, rather than people who just seem to want what young people everywhere seem to want, a chance to have a good life. And instead they get killed for complaining.
I think we need to get to the essence of this regime, though. I believe that the Gaddafi regime, if on February 21st, 2011, didn't say, I stand with my father, we need to kill the rats.
Right.
That was a regime that could have been reformed, both from the economic perspective, going back to 2005 and the Monitor Group reforms and the détente with the West and all of that. Certainly the Kuwaiti regime, it has a history of the Majlis going back to the 1890s.
Yeah.
I don't see the Iranian regime that way. I don't think it's a reformable regime because it is based on the concept of vilayat al-faqih. That means that the jurisconsult, the faqih, is to govern through his ijtihad, i.e. exegesis, of Shia religious law, and that he represents the Mahdi al-Muntadhir on earth. That is, to me, a theocratic regime, which is inherently beyond the kind of changes that you're describing. Ergo, if we find ourselves in this position, it needs to be a degree of regime change. Could some of those people, Larijani or others, say, we're now running a nationalist thing here and the army is following me? Yes. But I think they would have to make space for the youth, the supporters of the Shah, the Iranian diaspora who don't support the Shah but do support democracy, women. There are essentially no women in any positions in power in the country. And this regime cannot allow that to happen. It differs certainly from a Kuwaiti or even a Gaddafian regime, which to my mind was not nearly as ideological. The ideological was flexible. Here we're in a regime type, because of its theocratic nature, which doesn't have that flexibility, and I think that needs to be changed. I'm not sure that a uncongressionally approved military campaign is the right way to get there, but we're where we are now.
Let's talk about European responses to what has just happened, because Europe has been talking for some time now about becoming a geopolitical actor after the shock of the Russian invasion of Ukraine and the shock of the election of Donald Trump. And Europe has been a geopolitical actor when it comes to Ukraine. It hasn't been decisive in getting everything at once, but there has been a big show of unity and focus. Somehow, that is not there when it comes to the Middle East, and when anything happens in the Middle East, European countries seem to be split at least three ways. This has happened also with the attack on Iran, with a number of European countries really supporting it, some saying it's wrong and illegal, and others trying to delicately manoeuvre between not being convinced it's a great idea and not wanting to upset Donald Trump, which seems to be roughly where my own country finds itself. How can Europe get its act together, Jason?
I'm not sure I would agree with your characterization of where the UK is at. Keir could have let Trump used the Chagos bases. He could have let him use Akwatiri. They didn't. They're doing defensive strikes to protect Gulfi allies in Israel, and I think that that's good, you know. I wouldn't say that Keir has had an unprincipled position. I find fascinating is the partisan aspects here in the UK, where Farage and the Tories say we really should support this. And I was surprised that Kemi Badenoch has been like, wow, this is great. Do you know what I mean? We really should just get in on this. And not saying, I kind of care that the Congress declared war. Seems important, because if we go back to Tony Blair and the idea of modifying or trying to inform American behavior, it was that it was within the American system and within the congressional process. So I would have, if I was Kemi Badenoch, taken a more nuanced approach to that. I find that extremely, extremely interesting. I don't think that Zach Polanski's defense of the Iranian Ayatollahs or these hands-off Iran people who are protesting in Westminster have it right either. Do you know what I mean? To me, Keir's position is about right.
Sure, I think that on this one, Keir Starmer's position is pretty popular. I think that the majority of the British public, according to opinion polls over the years, they do not think much of Iran, but they also are not very keen on getting involved in a Middle East war in which we haven't been consulted and we don't know the strategy if there is one. So when I've seen recent polling by YouGov, it does suggest that people don't want to be part of this war. And that is true across different political parties. So, of course, people who support Lib Dems, Green, and the left of the Labour Party are more anti-war than others. But I think that many Conservatives have questions, and I think a lot of Reform supporters also just aren't interested. And then there's also a kind of middle ground of Conservatives who are saying, in an ideal world, we would be working with the US, but actually with our armed forces pretty broke, we should be staying away from wars that we don't need, and we should be focusing on building up our forces to be in a better position in the future. All that said, so much of the British military's focus over the years before the invasion of Ukraine was on the Gulf. It was on really building up relations and the military presence in the Gulf in order to be able to keep open the sea lanes of communication in the event of a regional war, and also to retain positions if there were future interventions in failed states in the Middle East and Africa. So there is this growing chance, I think, that the UK could get drawn in more if Iran keeps attacking Gulf countries, because, as you say, they're already involved defensively. They have defence alliances that go back to the foundation of the Gulf monarchies. You know, this is what the relationship has been based on. So there really is that danger of things. You know, Iran is, I think, maybe trying to do a so-called escalate to de-escalate strategy, and that can backfire, and it could result in a larger war that nobody actually chose or planned.
I think it would be good if Keir showed his value add to the Gulf states by trying to defend them. That seems like a nice thing. I think that there is a great moment for Europe not only to de-escalate, to propose solutions. I was a little surprised to see the Canadian and Australian statements, Jane, that they're like, oh yeah, we really support this. This is great. Whereas they could have said what I thought they'd say. We do think that this is legal under international law, and it is, both R2P-able and, it follows the defense of the protesters, but we need Congress. We need congressional approval because we believe in the American diplomatic and political process. That Albanese didn't do that, and that Carney, I think, missed a trick because he could really establish himself as, again, the leader of the free world. So maybe that's going to devolve to Macron now, where Macron has said, no, we don't think that this is the right way to go about this. But again, the Europeans need to do what Europeans can do, which is to have a jamboree conference. Now is the time to have that conference, likely in Switzerland. It needs to be in Switzerland for a whole range of reasons, probably at the Almani Embassy in Geneva. But it would be nice if it was organized not by the Swiss, but by the big players, meaning Germany, France, and Britain. And then the transition was discussed. I'm a real believer, following in what we have heard on the pod from our friends Marcel Dersis and Brian Klaas, who have talked about transitions and dictatorships. You offer Larijani and some nephews of the Ayatollah and some other random Hujjat al-Islams that they can have exile in Russia. And you say, we're not going to go after some of these ill-gotten gains, but you've got to have these IRGC troops stand down and stop killing your own people. That's a conversation that Europe should begin to have and to work on a transition, because I don't feel that Trump or Netanyahu have the diplomatic skills or inclination. So when it comes to ordering the disorder, this is just like there's an open goal for the Europeans.
So I think this is very interesting to look at the transition. I'm not convinced that someone like Larijani would take an offer to go into exile, but I think that the Europeans could also be saying, look, if this is all left in the hands of the Americans, it's going to go to the Board of Peace. There could be a regime change that means that basically the Board of Peace takes over Iran's land and Iran's oil. What we need to do is focus on Iran, its sovereignty, its ability to control its future, but that has to involve not killing Iranian people that express a different view to yours. Now, I don't know if Europe has got the credibility or the ability to do this, but I think it's interesting to imagine it positioning itself in that way to say there is a change coming, and let's try to make that a moderated and negotiated change that isn't actually like what happened in Venezuela.
I think it has to be real regime change, though, Jane. That's where we may differ. And the Europeans can say, if we're not protecting you, the Israelis will assassinate you. So it's like, I think that there are a lot of levers here. It doesn't matter if you're Arafi or Larijani or others. They can be assassinated. No one is unassassinatable now. Ergo, it would be nice to have a good cop, bad cop thing going on, and Europe can be the players. I think that the Europeans have a lot of credibility on Epstein, which is what the whole thing is about. The top table issue is Epstein. The Iran stuff is, just a consequence of that. And we've seen here, Mandelson has been pushed out, and he's under trial. The prince is no longer a prince. The Norwegians have had to have their former prime minister get interrogated, right? So because it's really about Epstein, that gives the Europeans credibility. It's like, we're working on these Epstein things, and we're going to provide an off-ramp here. I think that they're not going to do it, but they could. They could easily have these meetings in Switzerland with credibility because of their actions on Epstein, and saying to the Iranian new leadership or the Transitional Council or the Council of Experts, we're really sorry. You can't just have a Hujjat al-Islam running the country now. The people of Iran have spoken. If you don't want all of the next row of people to be assassinated, these are the steps to moving towards a democratic transition. And, you can actually go to exile in Russia. Because if there isn't that opportunity, you're going to get an Assad-like situation where they're just going to dig in. And they're going to dig in until they're defeated, and then that could be years. We don't want that. Could you imagine a situation where Iran has a protracted Syria level of violence, where we would be talking about millions and millions displaced and hundreds of thousands killed? That needs to be avoided at all costs, and we are where we are. I don't think that the Israelis and the Trumpians are going to be able to avoid that. We need diplomatic adults to be doing that, which I was hoping it could be Carney, but given what he said, it has to be Keir, Merz, and Macron.
I think a lot of the power to help influence the next steps is lying with Turkey and with the Gulf states, and I think Europeans should try to work with them where they can. I don't really think they can threaten to assassinate the rest of the government if they don't flee or go into exile, because that is embracing a regime change policy.
They'll just say, we can't protect you from the fact that the Israelis will do this.
And the Iranians will say to them, you can't protect us anyway.
I disagree. They can protect them. I mean, if exile is being arranged either in Turkey or Russia, they'll be protected. They're not going to get assassinated once they take the deal and leave the country.
I see. So they would protect them by giving them the exile deal.
Yeah, of course. Of course, Turkey and the Gulf is important. I'm a little under-impressed by what the Gulfies have done so far. You know, it's only like 36 hours in, right, while we're talking. The Gulfies have said, you know, we reserve the right to do stuff, but they haven't done much stuff yet. But yes, of course, if they would start to make some proposals or actually deploy their militaries to do things, you know, then they might have more leverage.
Look, I'd give credit to the Gulf, especially to Oman, which came up with an extremely detailed proposal mediated between the sides that fell at the last minute, you know, because there just was too much maximalist sticking to red lines. But I think in terms of working out what could have been a win-win compromise, they did a good job, and I think that they will still try to find ways to calm things down. And they've really been at the forefront of that. I think Europe and UN mediators should work with them more closely as well.
For sure.
We're just about out of time. And we'll need to come back to this topic extremely soon because it's fast moving. I'd like us to get some good Iranian experts onto the pod in coming episodes as well to learn from some of their expertise. Because this is a huge, huge deal and will continue to change quickly, I think.
Jane, you and I are not bored of peace. We actually like peace. We are very, very bored of people trying to distract from Epstein. And we hope that you enjoy our treatment of these very complicated topics. As always, our producer is the one, the only, the mega orderer, George McDonough. If you enjoy this content and you want it as soon as it comes out, what should people do, Jane?
They should join the Mega Orderers Club, which allows you to support what we do and get early access to everything we say, exclusive content, and from time to time, the chance to attend exciting live events.
And ad-free listening, that's key. You join the Mega Orderers Club via the link in the show notes, you get ad-free listening. Check out the Substack. I'm going to put some various articles about how the CIA helped pinpoint the gathering of Iranian leaders. Jane needs to go. She has like a real life with like family and responsibilities and stuff, unlike nerds who just read random Twitter about assassinations like I do. I have enjoyed chatting with you, and what do we wish the listeners, Jane?
We wish you an orderly week.